The helmet sat in the crook of his arm, like an extra weight he had learned to carry. It was scuffed on one side, the matte finish dulled by rain and the thumbprints of 1,000 put-on mornings. A strip of reflective tape ran along the back, the sort Courier jackets borrowed from habit rather than pride. Sunlight lay across the park path in a slow, bright band, and Juniper's small hand found the ridge where helmet met elbow and stayed there, warm and insistent. He had become good at being observed and not needing the attention, a careful rhythm of arrival, exchange, departure. Riding the motorcycle in slideshow minutes, traffic lights, the corner with the bakery, the bridge where the river smelled of damp metal, was the closest thing he had to a private life. There were packages to collect, envelopes to drop, other people's busy, pressed-for-time errands that accepted him without asking for more than punctuality and the polite nod of a man who made deliveries for a living. Thea Crowell watched the world, sometimes from the saddle of a bike, sometimes from the hard bench by the park pond. He was competent in a way that left little room for show. He did not volunteer stories about himself, which suited most people fine. To Juniper, who was 5 and knew the names of the clouds and where to find the best puddles for splashing, he was simply Thea, the man who held her hand at curbs, the man who remembered to carry home the extra pancakes she liked. To everyone else, he might be the quiet one or the steady neighbor. He was steady because he had to be. Juniper let her fingers curl and uncurl on his arm, watching a dog that had decided to leap after a plane of sunlight across the grass. "Daddy," she said, as if announcing a discovery about the sun itself, "why do some people look like they forgot to smile?" He turned to meet the question the way he met most small interrogations, from the surface inward, with care. She had a way of catching him off guard and making the world conspicuous in the small ways that mattered. He smiled then, a brief, private thing, not for show, but because she believed in the effect smiles had. "You can make them remember," he said. "Sometimes you just have to stop." Juniper beamed, as if he had told her a secret trick. She pointed across the path at a battery-operated ice cream cart shaded by a battered umbrella. The vendor, an older man with a tray of sprinkles and a face weathered to the texture of newsprint, was serving a young woman nearby. The woman held the hand of a small boy who hugged his knees like a child protecting something fragile. The boy looked as if he had learned to be careful with the world. Juniper hopped down from the bench and took both of Thea's hands. "Can we get one? Just a little one. For him," she said, nodding toward the woman and the boy. Thea hesitated in that particular way he had practiced his whole life, his body politely counting risks and obligations. He was on a route. There were parcels waiting in a sack fastened to the back of his bike, time windows to keep. A delivery man could not dilly-dally. But he saw the tension in the woman's jaw, the way she refused to meet the vendor's gaze, the way the boy watched the other children with a sort of cautious longing. In how he learned the world, to look is the first small act of kindness. He dug into his jacket for coins. Juniper's small face lit up like a lighthouse. They crossed the grass, boots scuffing, and Thea ordered a single cone extra. He placed it in the woman's hand before she could tell him to keep it, then watched as disbelief receded into something like relief. The woman, Sarin, accepted it with a fast, careful politeness. Up close, Thea noticed the faint line of worry that sat between her brows and the way her fingers curled protectively around her boy. There was no dramatics in her gratitude. She said simply, "Thank you," and the boy looked up, eyes suddenly huge with the astonishment of someone given a thing as ordinary as sweetness. Juniper handed the boy the cone with solemn ceremony. He took it as if it were treasure, and, between licks, glanced at Thea like a small ambassador. "My name's Junie," Juniper announced, with the grave importance of a child naming the world. "What's yours?" "Ashby," said the boy. The name stuck in the air like a small unlaid stone, then settled into the shared quiet. He ate with the slowness of someone unaccustomed to being the center of generosity. Thea lingered long enough to see them smile into the middle of themselves, and then, because the root clock was stern and habitual, he excused himself. He lifted his helmet, put his hand out to Juniper, and allowed her to climb back onto the seat behind him, the little body fitting under his jacket with reckless faith. As the motorcycle started, a single tone from the engine, the park felt briefly like a painting in which he had stepped. If a small kindness has ever changed your day, tell us about it in the comments. The rest of that Sunday was ordinary in the way most ordinary things are. A short delivery to a florist, a signature on a digital pad from someone who thanked him in the clipped manner of a manager on a lunch break, the smell of lavender from a shop doorway. The motorcycle hummed against the low city wind, and Juniper drew circles in the air with the edge of her mitten. From time to time, she pressed her cheek against his back and mumbled observations about clouds and dogs and the way people folded their hands when they were worried. On his last stop before heading home, he eased out of traffic into a small square by the cafe where they sometimes ate pancakes. There were benches and a short wall that caught the low afternoon light. He had instructions to collect a small parcel from a boutique nearby, a box that would fit in his satchel like a secret. It was a routine that required only the passenger side mirror and the exchange of a password typed into a phone. Routine rarely changed him. The florist's assistant handed over the parcel with the same pragmatic smile as before. As Thea carried it toward the bike, he noticed the ice cream cart again, parked in the shadow of a plane tree, and the vendor talking in low tones to a woman who looked the same as the one in the park. It was the same mother and boy they'd shared a cone with 20 minutes earlier. Life in the city, compressed and repeated, offered small second chances. They were in sight of the cafe doorway when a sudden movement cleaved the calm. The vendor's hat tumbled off his head. A young man, thin, with a backpack that seemed to ride too high on his shoulders, lunged, the motion an ugly jag of need and panic. He reached toward the woman's bag in one clumsy swoop. The boy shrank into himself as if the world had become a place too loud and too sharp. Where the ice cream had been a bright, safe thing, now the air tasted of startled fear. It happened in the time it takes to blink. Thea felt the world shift into a narrower corridor of attention. He had seen similar scenes before in his routes, the quick hands at markets, teenagers who made reckless choices when the city's margins tightened. But this was close enough to touch. He tightened his grip on the parcel and stepped forward with that quiet geometry of a man accustomed to moving through crowds. He did not shout. He did not try to be dramatic. He positioned himself between the fleeing figure and the child, as if standing on a hinge. His body filled a space that left fewer angles of escape. He was not a man who liked violence. There was no theater in him for confrontation. Instead, his voice found a low, even thread. "Oi, stop," he said, and it wasn't a command so much as an offering of attention, an insistence that somebody was watching. The thief paused, his hand twisting on the strap of the bag. For the briefest moment, Thea saw the rawness under the young man's expression. Hunger, a clutch of shame, the quick panic of a plan gone wrong. It was all of a second. Then the man tried to push through the small crowd. Another passerby stepped forward, a woman with a messenger bag, and between them the space for escape narrowed. Thea moved gently, not to strike, but to block. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder with an impatient politeness that said, "We can make this stop." It was the kind of touch that does not humiliate. It registered as the simple interposition of a fellow human. The thief wriggled free with a shift of weight that knocked Thea slightly back. The man scraped his knee on the cobbles as he ran. A small red smear sat on the skin like a punctuation. No one chased him. He disappeared into a tangle of alleyways and bicycle racks, swallowed by the movement of the city. What remained was quiet and tender in its own way. Sarin fumbling with her bag, the vendor placing his hat back on his head with an embarrassed laugh that did not hide his relief. Ashby staring at the place where danger had nearly touched him, and then turning to Juniper with a look that said, "Thank you without words." The silence after the panic made room for small, ordinary things. The vendor's hands were trembling as he handed Juniper the cone she'd dropped in surprise. Someone offered the frightened boy a tissue. Thea felt his heart working in a way it hadn't for a long time. He noticed that he had a thin abrasion on his palm, the skin smarting. It was nothing dramatic, no trophies, no blood, but it belonged to a body that had done something in a moment when most people would look away. A stranger had reached for his phone and, of course, filmed a few seconds. A look of him standing in the square, helmet tucked under his arm, merely steady. The clip would be a sliver of the day on someone's feed by evening, captioned with whatever part of the story people like to keep for themselves. "Are you all right?" the vendor asked. His voice was small. "I'm fine," Thea said. He did not accept the man's outstretched hand for thanks. That would have been too much attention. He checked Juniper discreetly. She was fine, already inventing a new cloud shape with her thumb. And then he turned to Sarin. She was watching him in a way that made him aware of himself, as if he were under light. He saw appreciation there, but also a guardedness rehearsed through hardships. She said nothing about heroics. She did not need to. "We should call the police," someone said. Thea nodded at the sensible practicality of it, though in the end, the thief was a silhouette swallowed by the city before officers could do more than take a statement. The vendor gave Thea a look of gratitude that did not demand more than he could give. The woman with the messenger bag squeezed his shoulder. Cameras clicked. "They call him a silent hero sometimes," Juniper announced later that evening, as they walked home along a road lined with stew of sunlight and shadow. She had heard the fragment of the clip someone had posted. The same passer-by who had filmed now, narrating the incident in the clipped, earnest way people narrate good deeds online. They didn't like his actions dissected, and yet the label landed on him with a kind of gentle absurdity. He had not done it to be seen. He did not say anything about being a hero. He folded the slight ache from his palm into the pocket of his coat and rode the last few miles with a small, stubborn quietness. The label might stick like an adjective, but his interior life was a more complex seamwork. Grief, habit, the blend of worry and love for a daughter who had survived the worst of the first years and yet still needed him to teach her how to tie shoelaces. When they opened the flat door, Juniper ran straight to her room to draw the event with crayons. Thea on a bike, a cone mid-air, a small blank circle marked as a thief. It was remarkable how children could reduce a moment to a single icon and make it whole. The week that followed felt like an extended rehearsal for ordinary life. Thea delivered parcels, collected payments, and learned to read the microclimate of city queues. Juniper progressed with the small victories of kindergarten, finger paints that stayed on paper for a whole afternoon, and she told him new things every day without expecting answers in return. Thea took the small pleasure in those disclosures because there was nothing else to do but be present for them. Sarin and Ashby were a presence at the edges of his days. They crossed paths with him at the cafe more often than chance would have it. Sarin swept tables before the morning peak, and the cafe owner, a kindly woman named Mags, who liked to offer people extra sausages when business permitted, looked after them with the sort of affection that cost nothing and meant everything. Over drip coffee and reheated scones, there were small exchanges. A nod, a borrowed smile, a shared table on rainy afternoons when the city pressed everyone closer. One Tuesday, after the cafe closed and the steam stacks had finished their last low moan, Sarin came into the quiet of the shop to ask about a job. She approached it in the careful way of someone who had written an application in her head 100 times and still felt exposed by the asking. The cafe had no positions for her at that moment, not officially. Thea, who happened to be there fixing a small electrical slip after his bike had pinged him an alert about a light, overheard her. He lingered in the doorway as if by accident, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he wanted to do something practical. He had a room. He had spare hours between routes. He had, in a modest pair of drawers, the inclination to turn a hand to a problem that wasn't his alone. The thought of offering it surprised him in its ease. There are offers that are generous in ways that bark. This one had the sound of a spade in soft earth. "Would you like paid work?" he asked, the question sparing in itself. Not charity, not favor, but work with terms, a price, and the dignity of exchange. Sarin paused. For a heartbeat, she measured the costs of acceptance. The suspicion that someone might expect more than simple labor. The fear of becoming indebted. Financial insecurity carved its lines around hope like an experienced mason. She had been proud for so long. To accept help was to alter an interior geography. "I can't take anything that's a pity job," she said, which was to say she could not be reduced to a narrative she had not chosen. "It wouldn't be," Thea replied. "You'd get paid for what you do. There's a room at my flat, if you needed it. But I'm not looking to take anything for free. Just practical help, if that makes sense." Sarin's eyes shifted. He saw the outline of a person realizing that dignity could sometimes be offered with terms attached, rather than as alms. She thought of Ashby's schoolbooks, the nights when the washing machine hiccuped and there was no spare coin. She thought of the small room she could fold into, a rental that would lend them stability for a while. "How long?" she asked finally. "As long as it works," he said. The vagueness was kinder for being honest. His flat was not large. It would require rearrangement, recalculation. But he had, in a way older than money, the capacity to share what he had in order to keep people from fracturing. They agreed to meet in the morning to talk details. The arrangement would be paid work with a fixed number of hours and a clear understanding of boundaries. He would not demand favors beyond what was agreed. The terms mattered to him as much as to her. Ashby watched the exchange from a corner of the cafe with a mistrust that was less a judgment and more a protective reflex. He had learned that adults often promised islands that later erased under tide. He kept his watch on Thea like a small sentry who had been deputized into belief. That evening when they walked home, Juniper asked them both, "So, does this mean we'll all live together?" Sarin looked at Thea searchingly. There was a tremble in her voice as she asked, as if naming such a thing might set it into motion. "It means we will try," Thea said. His voice broke on the last word, with an honesty he did not intend to make showy. It was the first time in a long while he had offered himself not merely as a provider of practicalities, but as a participant in a household. The first tentative days of that tentative agreement were the shape of a careful waltz. Sarin arrived with a small suitcase, neat enough that its contents suggested thrift and precision. 2 shirts, a pair of well-broken-in trainers, Ashby's folded pajamas. She brought a slice of the world that was her competence, tricks for tying shoelaces in ways that would not come undone, a recipe for an omelette that held its own in a city of frozen pizzas. They established routines out of necessity and small mutual respect. Thea took the morning school run because his route passed near the kindergarten. Sarin made Thursday dinners because she liked the rhythm of planning a meal and seeing it arrive whole on a plate. Juniper, who had never had to share much in the way of domestic space, began to learn the choreography of living with another child. How to divide crayons, the art of taking turns in the bathtub. There were frictions, the small kind that come with the cohabitation of 2 households. Ashby and Juniper bickered over television choices, and there were nights in which the flat seemed too small for 4 people and too big with 2 sets of griefs humming along. Sarin had a habit of folding towels in a way Thea had not known possible. Her folding irritated yet comforted him because it revealed the orderliness she kept inside. He appreciated it without knowing how to say so. On a Wednesday morning, as the 3 of them moved in the stillness before city traffic, A letter arrived folded into Thea's mailbox. It was from an investor whose name Thea had known as someone who softened the sharp corners of small projects with shallow pockets. For months, Thea had been balancing a plan for a modest renovation to his flat. A practical reworking that would make room for rent payments and the possibility of extra earnings from a side project involving small deliveries for local businesses. The investor's support had been a kind of oxygen. It would allow them to breathe without collapsing into debt. The letter's heading was polite, the content clipped. There was a paragraph about recalibration and market movement, and then, in the same line, a phrase Thea read twice to make sure his eyes were not tricking him. The investor had to pull out. The words were not dramatic. They were an administrative suture pulled too soon. But to Thea, they landed with the kind of weight that makes the floor feel less stable. He folded the letter with care, like something that might mend itself, given the right touch. Saren noticed his silence and did not ask publicly. She could read the pattern of worry in the way he retied a shoelace, the way his fingers tapped twice against the table as if testing for solidity. That evening, when Ashby had been told to do his homework and Juniper was making a card for her mother, an act of devotion rendered in glitter and earnest words, Thea sat at the kitchen table and calculated in the unromantic way of someone who learned to be practical. Numbers did not lie. They tightened around the possibility of the home he had imagined for them. He could weather this if things were rearranged, if he sold a thing or cut a corner, but the solutions were not without their own casualties. Selling the house he owned would mean parting with the stability of the old sort. A physical address that felt like continuity against the daily erosion of life. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, a small, candid shot of him and Juniper at the pier, on a day when the wind had been a mischievous companion. His wife's absence, a constant small ache, made the photograph both treasure and tenderness. The thought of selling the place where those things were kept made his chest ache in a way that was not to be cured by shuffling numbers. Saren watched him from the doorway as if listening to the arithmetic of another person's heart. She had her own ledger of fears. The pull of the city's margins had taught her the language of contingency, but she also had the fierce knowledge that sometimes a house is not the same as a home. Sometimes a home is the composition of people and the choices that keep them together. When Thea finally spoke, it was not in the rhetorical fashion of a speech, but in the practical voice of someone who had to decide. "We can sell," he said. The words sat like stones on the table. "If it means we can stay together and not have to scatter." Saren's face changed with that. She weighed the offer against an old economy of pride and against the new economy of mutual survival. She could not pretend the choice was easy. "I don't want you to feel like you have to do that for us," she said. Her voice held a tremor of something that was almost gratitude and almost protest. "It isn't for you alone," he said. "It's for Juniper as much as it is for you, for Ashby, for the idea that we keep what matters and let the rest go. In the end, not all choices are made in grand gestures. They are made in a sequence of small decrees. The decision to sign a document, to accept a visitor at the door, to let another person fold towels the way they wanted to. That night, they stood together on the narrow balcony outside his living room and watched the city lights bloom into their well-worn constellations. Juniper held Ashby's hand in both of hers, as if conducting a tiny orchestra of assurance. He imagined the work of boxing up the rooms, the practicalities of listing and lawyers, and the small sting of goodbye to a house that had been his anchor. He imagined, with the stubbornness of someone whose grief had taught him the value of staying, the intimacy of 4 people at a table, their hands reaching in for more than platters, reaching for each other. There would be costs. There would be nights when the decision felt like giving up something secure. But Thea had been learning that stability was not the same thing as possession. It could be an arrangement of people who chose each other again and again. As the city settled into a hush around them, and the motorcycle waited under the lamp for another day's errands, Thea felt, for the first time in a long season, the sensation of a future being written in the present tense. Small strokes. A slow composition. He tightened his hand around Juniper's and realized that the heroic thing was not always the loud and visible. Sometimes it was the steady repetition of showing up, of stepping into the silence between people and carrying the weight without asking for medals. They went to bed that night, with the room smelling of warm tea and toast crumbs. Juniper left a picture beside Thea's pillow of a motorcycle and 4 people and a big sun. In the morning they would begin the practical work of making a decision tangible. Drawing up lists, making calls, accepting that life must sometimes be traded inward for the sake of being outwardly present. Outside, beneath the street lamp, the helmet waited, scuffed and reflective, the memory of a day compressed into a small, ordinary object. He had stopped a robbery while on a delivery, a brief motoring interruption that the internet would call heroic in 2 lines of text, and yet in his chest, the larger act was only beginning to unfold, the quiet, unglamorous choosing to stay. The next days would ask for more than goodwill. They would require the stacking of boxes, the negotiation of money, the tenderness of 2 children learning the geography of a shared home. There stood at the cusp of that work, like someone at the top of a hill before descent, holding a helmet under his arm and the weight of choices like coals in his hands. He was not a man who needed accolades. He needed to be noticed in the ways that mattered, noticed by the people he loved enough to change for. When he closed his eyes that night, he did not see the run of the thief down the alleyways. He saw, instead, Juniper's small hand in his, Ashby's hesitant grin as he learned to trust, Saren folding towels without being asked. He saw the park bench where they had sat, and the cone, now a small story they retold with different inflections at each telling. Heroism, he thought, could be a quiet noun, something to do with staying put and making room. There was, he realized, an odd kind of bravery in the ordinary, to hold a scraped palm and not make it into a badge, to sell a house and transform the loss into shelter for others, to accept help and not be diminished. He had stopped a thief in a public corner, and the city had called him a silent hero. But the quieter, harder task lay ahead, in the boxes, in the negotiations, in the ironing out of schedules, and the listening to small fears at night. The morning that Saren came with the first of Ashby's things, she brought a plant wrapped in newspaper. "He likes to garden," she said. The plant was small and green, a shy thing in a clay pot. It belonged on a windowsill, she said, somewhere that got good light. There found a place for it in his kitchen, and as he set it down, he realized that life would have to be tended in ways that matched the plant's modest needs. Water, light, the occasional turn so it didn't grow lopsided. They did not all know yet how to be a family. They only knew how to take the first sober steps toward it. An offer, an acceptance, a decision to let go of a house in exchange for being together. There would be disagreements, nights of tight budgets and frayed patience. There would also be the small wonders. A school's open day that felt like a festival when everyone showed up. The taste of a dinner that smelled like someone else's kitchen, and oddly, felt like home. For now, they had struck the first note. The city moved around them, indifferent and necessary, a rhythm of receiving angles. The motorcycle was a tool and a symbol and a habit. Tia would continue to ride it, and in those rides be given the chance to see other people's small emergencies. He would step in again if required, not for glory, but because seeing had become a practice for him, and seeing meant answering when the world asked. At the center of it all was Juniper, who slept with her fingers twisted around the corner of her blanket, and who dreamed nothing larger than a very big sun. She did not know yet that the days ahead would ask theirs to be a household, with creases and effort. She only knew that the man who had once been quiet now stood at the door with a helmet in his hand and a face that had learned to soften. They would, in time, learn the contours of one another, the way muscles flex when someone else holds the line. Thea walked past the windows and watched the city pour itself on without ceremony. He had stopped a robbery while making a delivery, and the label "Silent Hero" attached to him like an extra coat he never asked for. It was helpful in the way it drew eyes once, less helpful in teaching him how to sleep. Later that week, he would make the calls about valuers, and would begin the slow, administrative unspooling of the life he had anchored himself to. But tonight, the small plant sat on the sill, and Juniper's breathing sounded like a contented tide. He made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and unfolded the list he had started in the margin of a notepad. To sell the house, to set out terms for the new arrangement, to speak with the investors' council. Each line was a kind of promise. Each line also left room for choice. He knew it would not be clean. It would not be tidy. Sometime in the bustle of unpacking and scheduling and paying, they would encounter a moment that demanded the steadiness he had shown in the square, a quieter courage perhaps, but still courage. That thought steadied him almost as surely as a hand on a shoulder had steadied the thief a few days prior. There set the list down and, as if rehearsing, said Juniper's name aloud. She stirred and smiled in her sleep, unaware of the ledger that would define the next months. He went to bed with an ache that was not regret, but the particular sorrow of someone who knows the cost of a necessary decision. He had become the kind of person who would, when it mattered, stop. But stopping was not enough if he did not also remain. He was learning that his role as a quiet man was not to pass through life unseen, but to be present in the long, unflashy work of keeping others close. In the small hours, before the city learned to wake again, Thea rose and stood on the balcony with his hands in his pockets. The helmet was in the hall by the door. He felt the tiny scrape under his palm and traced it with his thumb as if reading the memory of that afternoon. He had acted without seeking applause. He had been, for a sliver of time, someone who interposed himself between harm and helplessness. They would call him a silent hero, and perhaps they already had. But what he wanted was not to be named. He wanted to be present. He wanted the stubborn, patient work of family to be something he could do well. Dawn was a thin promise on the horizon. He stood and watched the light grow, thinking of the boxes they would have to fill, the small plant on the sill, the way Juniper insisted the sun ought to be big enough to fit everyone. He closed his eyes on the day to come, feeling its weight and its slenderness, and in that moment, a decision felt less like a sacrifice and more like a deliberate, gentle choosing, an ongoing act of quiet courage. The morning the valuer arrived, the light in the hallway split along the stair runner in a way that made the dust look soft instead of accusing. Thea opened the door before the bell had finished its ring, watching the thin man with a clipboard navigate the short distance across the threshold as if he were stepping into someone else's breath. He wore a cardigan that made him look like a careful bird. When he smiled, the eyes at the corners wrinkled with the practiced politeness of a tradesman who had seen many homes in various states of repair. Juniper, who had been up first and had already arranged a small constellation of crayons on the hallway table, came to stand beside Thea and peered at the man's shoes. "Do they like houses?" she asked, as if the question made sense of the exchange. "They like to think they do," Thea said. He let a smile press at the edges, small and true. He had rehearsed what he would say to a valuer and found that the arithmetic of emotion rarely fit into neat boxes. So instead, he showed the house. The way sunlight lay across the kitchen tiles at noon, the cupboard that always held an emergency tin of beans for late nights, the peg by the door where a damp jacket, the same one the thief had grazed, hung with the dignity of a workhorse. They went through the rooms together. The valuer spoke of comparables and slightly different neighborhoods, of amenities that made one price a little higher and another lower. He measured with his eyes, with the practiced geometry of a man who turned houses into numbers. Thea listened, and sometimes he offered small facts: the age of the boiler, the right corner for evening light, how the back wall never quite warmed in winter. The valuer took notes with a mechanical calm and left, his small bird cardigan disappearing down the path into the city that kept its edges sharp. After he left, Thea stood for a long time in the room that had been his bedroom and his refuge. The photo on the mantel had been turned slightly to face the window. The light touched the faces and made them small and intimate. He pressed his palm against the worn banister, following the old grooves as if they were the lines of a map. There were things in that house that would be boxed up and taken away, plates that had held dinners, a chair that had once been a place for two. But there were also things that would not fit inside moving vans. The way the house smelled of rain in late summer, the small habitual sounds of pipes, the names the children had given the cracks in the plaster. The sale moved forward with a slowness that made each step feel like the lowering of a curtain. Viewings came and went. A couple with a toddler admired the kitchen and asked about local schools. An older gentleman liked the study and wanted somewhere to keep his old guitars. Each visitor rearranged their eyes in the rooms as if trying to imagine their lives in a space that had become, for Thea, partly sacred. He went through these motions with the practical air of someone used to delivering other people's packages, accepting signatures, noting preferences, removing himself politely when asked to leave a room. Sarin watched the visits from her seat at the cafe table, where she had begun to keep the habit of calling over every afternoon. She had helped Thea clear a shelf one evening, folding small things into a box with a dexterity that made the task less clinical and more careful. When she spoke to him about the house, it was plainly without ceremony. "It'll be strange," she said, "for both of us. But people find new sorts of roots." "Roots can be replanted," Thea said. He meant it with the same kind of steady faith he used for early morning deliveries. Small actions, repeated in the right order, build something that may look like permanence. The offers came, one after another, and finally, one stuck. It was not wildly above the asking price. It was, in fact, just sufficient. The buyer was a young family with a practical manner and the kind of attention that did not require explanation. They wanted the house because it held warmth and light and had the sort of irregularities small children found adventures in. Thea signed the documents with the same calm he had when taking a parcel's receipt. There was a moment, pen hovering, when the weight of the signature felt heavier than he expected. He thought of the mantel photograph and then of Juniper asleep, with her picture of a big sun on the pillow beside him, and he let the pen move. Moving day arrived not with fanfare, but with a corrugated sense of industry. Friends from the cafe and neighbors who had chatted in passing offered boxes and heavy-lift manners. Mags turned up with a thermos of scalding coffee and a tin of biscuits. The ice cream vendor, Mr. Patel, who had learned the names of Juniper and Ashby in 2 afternoons, brought a tub of raspberry sorbet for the children that tasted of bright, recklessly nostalgic summers. There was, amid the packing, a surprising softness. Ashby was careful with other people's things, treating the framed prints as if they were small boats the wrong handling could sink. He helped Thea disassemble a bookshelf, while Juniper insisted on making labels for every box, her handwriting forming a cacophony of certainty. Sarin folded shirts in the precise way she'd always done, stacks leaning like tidy cliffs. There was chatter, and also a space for small silences in which grief loosened its grip and made room for the business of living. At noon, Thea found himself in the attic with a box of things he had not yet decided on. He sat on the floor with the lid off and pulled out the familiar items, one by one. There was the old camera he'd used for a handful of occasions, the last photographs his wife had taken before she fell ill, its leather strap softened by use. He carefully wound the strap around his finger and suddenly, unbidden, felt a fiercer wish to keep something that belonged only to her. He almost closed the box and put it aside, but Juniper's small voice downstairs called for help untying a label, and the moment passed, like a shutter closing and reopening. "What if we put a photograph in the van?" Juniper suggested later, as they paused on the pavement and ate the free sorbet handed out by Mr. Patel. "So the house won't be lonely." Thea leaned into the joke, half cruel, half devotional, and said, "Houses don't get lonely. People get lonely." She pursed her lips in the way of someone profoundly thinking, and then declared, "This house will still remember us." She drew a small heart in the condensation on her cup, and then licked her finger and stuck it there, as if her print could anchor the place. They filled the van and emptied the rooms. At the old kitchen table, they ate sandwiches from a paper bag and passed around the heavy, ordinary plates that had seen too much life. There were moments of laughter that seemed to come out of nowhere, surprising and loud. There were also moments of sudden want, a cup Thea had been fond of, the scoop from the garden that had dug treasures when Juniper was small. Each item placed in a box had a small story attached, and each time a hand lifted a lid, that story moved with it. When the van finally pulled away, and the house sat with its boxes like a brief, arranged absence, Thea felt a thinner kind of ache. The removal had been practical and tidy, and still it left a space shaped exactly like a family of memories. The buyers moving in would follow, and there would be new laughter in the rooms that had been his. The city's movement simply accommodated the transfer of the domestic universe from one set of hands to another. The new house they had chosen was smaller, and deliberately chosen for the things that mattered. A garden that was large enough for a tomato plant, a living room that let light fall in at breakfast, and a sense that the neighbors would be steady in their own quiet ways. It was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be anything other than a place to live with a sensible ratio of rent to space. Thea had negotiated with the landlord a lease that allowed the four of them to stay together, and the agreement had made the practical worry of legalities softer. The first night in the new house had the tentative feel of a newly sewn seam. They arranged a temporary bed for Ashby in the corner. Juniper had a bed she declared magnificent because of the curtains, and Sarin set the plant on the sill like a small ambassador of hope. Thea made pancakes to celebrate the first dawn they would spend there. They were a little too thin and a little too crisp at the edges, but everyone ate them like it was a festival. Days settled into a pale pattern: school runs, deliveries, work hours, and small shared dinners. Thea's routes adjusted to the geography of the new postcode. He found a bakery with a barista who learned Juniper's name and the exact way she liked her hot chocolate. Sarin found a part-time shift in a local nursery and brought home stories of triumphs: Ashby helping a baby tie a shoelace, and small embarrassments: a spilled painting water tray that turned the playroom into a marbled ocean. Ashby changed, in the way small boys do when they are given steady things. He started to sleep through the small noises at night without waking. He began to take part in simple household tasks, his hands learning the cadence of a new family life. He called Thea Mr. T once, and it stuck in the kind of way nicknames often do, softening formal edges. He grew more solicitous of Juniper, at times being the fierce defender he had needed when they first met at the park. There were tests, as there always are when households blend. Money had to be counted carefully. There were evenings when the conversations dwindled into logistical lists and the fatigue settled into bony presence. There were also evenings when they sat on the small back step and watched the sky and let the near silence be companionable rather than lonely. Mags would sometimes knock with a tray of leftover pasties or send in a tin of something sweet. And Mr. Patel would swap scoops of experimental flavors in return for stories about the children's antics. The temporary chores became rituals. Ashby learned how to check the bins on Wednesday. Juniper made sure plants were watered on Thursdays, and Sarin cooked a particular Sunday stew that smelled of rosemary and massaged the week into order. Thea, who had been the quiet force behind early rises and late deliveries, found himself unexpectedly domestic in ways he had not forecasted. He fixed a tap, replaced a loose hinge, learned how to coax a stubborn lawnmower into life. He was practical without pride, and in that practical humility, his presence accumulated into something else. Trust. One crisp morning in autumn, the children came home from school with small cardboard certificates, participation in a harvest fair the local primary had held, and they burst through the door with the kind of raw happiness that undid fatigue. They wanted to tell everyone about their day, and the house hummed with the sorts of trivial triumphs that stitch ordinary life. Sarin, one evening, found Thea in the living room with the camera he'd decided to keep. He was sitting with it on his lap like a relic that had gathered a particular kind of weight. She sat beside him, folding a towel with the precise ritual that had become a small comfort to them all. "You kept it," she said simply. He smiled without looking up. "Pictures are stubborn," he replied. "They refuse to forget." She placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that conveyed 1,000 quiet sympathies. "You could take pictures now," she said, "of this." He thought of that for a long time. He had photographs of his wife and Juniper at the pier. He had not yet taken many of their new life. There had been a reluctance, a fear that by photographing joy he might seem to assume permission of the future. But she was right. Photographs did not promise anything. They simply kept what had happened intact for the small satisfactions of memory. So he lifted the camera, pointed it in the general direction of the small table where the children argued about whose turn it was to set a place, and pressed the shutter. The sound was small but decisive. There were moments, even here, when the old grief pressed forward. On rare evenings, when the city had quieted, and the curtains had been drawn, and the children had been tucked in, Thea would sit with the ache like a quiet companion. He did not demand it be placated. He let it exist, like a tempered echo. Sarin's presence was not one of erasing what had been lost. It was one of making room around the absence so that it did not become an island. The community, which had tacitly watched the small family form, offered a steadying hum. There was a neighbour's dinner, in which Mags sent over a curry, and someone else brought a pie. They were invited and sat at a table with other people who had small stories of saving and losses, and odd victories. Conversation bobbed. There were mentions of earlier times, of city changes that had displaced older faces. They did not ask for pity. They accepted the simple company of people who were willing to eat together. As the months lengthened, Juniper and Ashby formed a small private language. They discovered each other's jokes and developed rituals. Ashby would always hide Juniper's lost gloves in the most unlikely places, and then wait until she had almost given up searching before producing them with the solemnity of a triumphant archaeologist. Juniper would narrate their days in such a way that made the most ordinary tasks sound like adventures. Their friendship was not a cure, but a slow, patient stitch in the fabric of both their worlds. One afternoon, a few months after the move, Thea was at a small crosswalk making a delivery when he noticed a woman arguing with a landlord at the corner shop about being overcharged for a bill. Thea had not intended to interrupt. His day was full of time windows and ticking, but such things had a way of snagging his attention. He lingered, and his presence, quiet, steady, was enough for the woman to stop shouting and for the man to soften. It was the sort of small intervention that did not make news, but made life kinder. He continued to be one who stopped. Not every moment required him to be in front. Many moments only needed someone to look and to stay. The petty, quotidian acts of noticing, returning a lost umbrella, helping a supermarket trolley with a stubborn wheel, answering a child's question with serious calm, accumulated like small coin. People called him the silent man, less as a criticism and more as a compliment. He did not live for labels, but the labels did something useful. They helped others know where someone could be found when needed. There was an evening when the neighborhood cafe held a small celebration for the children at the school, an autumn fireworks night that was mild and local. The square filled with families, and a low, cheerful chaos settled over the park. Mags had set up a van with hot chocolate, and the ice cream vendor, Mr. Patel, handled marshmallows with an artistry the children adored. They sat on blankets with their faces lit by small lights and the occasional flicker from a neighbor's hand-decorated lantern. As the sky darkened, Juniper asked Thea about the time he'd stopped the thief. She had internalized the story and retold it like a fable with a small eye for detail. "Did you ever wish you'd told everyone about it?" she asked, as if the question belonged to the category of big philosophical matters. He thought of his scarred palm, the camera's clip on a passerby's feed, the quiet thanks from the vendor. He thought of what the act had meant, not to be seen, but to be present. "No," he said. "I wanted to be useful. Being useful doesn't always come with applause." Sarin, who was close by with Ashby on her lap, overheard and nodded, as if agreeing to something that had been settled between them long ago. The simple economy of their lives had taught them new ways of valuing acts, the sitting up late to help with a homework sheet, the way someone made a bed without complaint, the quiet taking of calls to coordinate a plumber when a pipe burst. Those things were heroics of a different order, slow, patient, necessary. On the subject of applause, the clip of the robbery had receded into the background. The internet had its cycles. After a day or two, the moment had been a tiny footnote among others. Occasionally, Thea would be recognized at the cafe, a nod here, a quiet thanks there, and he received those gestures with the same modesty he afforded most things. He did not like being held up as an exemplar. He preferred to let the act speak, in the small, private language of people who take joy in fixing a problem rather than advertising the fact. There was a time, later that winter, when an old friend of Thea's, someone he'd worked with in the early days of his courier rounds, came to visit. They drank tea and spoke of routes and days gone by. The friend, having seen the clip of the robbery months earlier, asked with a half-teasing curiosity whether Thea felt different about himself afterward. "Not really," Thea answered. "It was an action that happened. The question is what you do the rest of the time." The friend laughed softly. "That's very reasonable," he said, and then added, "But I hope you know, in case no one else says it, that it mattered." Thea accepted the sentiment as if it were a small gift. He did not like to hold on to praise, but he did not discard kindness either. Spring arrived with a gradual unspooling. They planted tomatoes in the back garden, and Ashby took to watering them with a devotion he showed to very few things. He stood with a watering can and was solemn as a priest. Thea taught the children how to measure the soil and when to pinch off extra shoots. There were small lessons about patience and timing, and a kind of gentle care that was not demanding. Juniper, who had been instructed to write a letter to the child she'd most admired at school, produced an eloquent missive to the class pet, a tortoise called Mrs. Tibbles, and in doing so produced a line that would stay with Thea. "Mrs. Tibbles doesn't run away," she wrote, "but she is brave because she keeps going slowly." The line made him smile in the parks where he rode his bike. It was the same small ethic he lived by, being steady, persistent, sometimes invisible, but always there. Later in the year, to mark the anniversary of the day they'd first met Sarin and Ashby, they returned to the park bench, where a cone had first been handed over, and where a thief had once been repelled by an even more ordinary courage. The bench had been painted since then, the slats new and smelling of varnish, but the place was recognizable. They sat together and ordered 4 ice creams from Mr. Patel, who grinned when he saw them, and insisted on adding extra sprinkles for the children. Juniper and Ashby ate with the kind of ceremony they'd perfected, careful sharing, deliberate stories between licks. Thea watched them and felt the gentle tide of his choices settle into place. The household he had built by choosing to stay had become less precarious and more domestic, less temporary and more chosen. He thought of the house they'd left, of the photograph that had travelled with them into the new kitchen, and of the plant on the sill that turned toward the mercy of morning light. "Do you remember the man who took the cone?" Juniper asked Ashby, who looked up between bites and nodded. He had a helmet. Juniper pointed to Thea's head, as if asking permission to label him. Ashby considered, then declared, "He isn't a hero. He's a keeper." The word struck Thea as precisely right. It had nothing to do with the more glamorous kinds of bravery, and everything to do with stewardship, keeping people safe, keeping children fed, keeping the small things in order. He had stopped a robbery while on a delivery once. The city had written that down in a small clip. But to be a keeper, to tend the chinks that make life hold together, required a different, longer patience. As they sat, a passerby walked past with a camera on his shoulder, one of those hobbyists who liked city light, and paused for a moment. He had seen Thea in the square before and gave a polite nod, a recognition that had nothing performative about it. Thea nodded back and felt the reciprocity of small acknowledgments. It was enough. They finished the ice creams and walked to the playground where the children ran until dusk, the park echoing with the sounds of unearned joy. Thea pushed Juniper on the swing and found, in the rhythm of motion, the same evenness he cultivated in his days, a cadence of arrival and return. On their way back, as they rounded the corner by the cafe, Mags waved from behind the counter and handed Juniper an extra pancake to take home. Thea thanked her and offered a small, brief smile that felt like a contract kept. That night, after the children were asleep and the house held its private hum, Thea sat with Sarin at the tiny kitchen table. They drank tea and spoke of nothing and everything. The conversation flowed in the small, important ways of people who had learned to share rooms and stories. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped?" Sarin asked casually, as if the question were no heavier than a tea bag. He considered. "I think I would have kept doing other things. People still do what they can. My stopping didn't avert some great fate. It just changed one life that day. But the rest, that's up to us." She nodded and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. The gesture said more than words, that she trusted him to be steady in the long-run work of keeping a household, and, perhaps, to be available when the city nudged with its small emergencies. There were small honors in the months that followed that did not make the news, but made life easier. A woman who ran a book club across the road offered to babysit one evening so Sarin could do extra hours at the nursery. The bakery owner gave Thea a small discount for a while after he'd helped fix a sign out front. The recognition was practical, not performative. It offered utility rather than applause. That was the kind of gratitude that fitted their lives best. On a bright morning, months after the move, Juniper and Ashby were at the front gate, with 2 tickets clutched in their hands. They had saved pocket money to go to a small local fair that had come to the square. They asked if Thea would come. He had a shift that morning, but he rearranged his deliveries, phoned a couple of clients, and came. He turned up in his jacket with his helmet slung under his arm, and felt, not for the first time, the old rhythm of riding knit with the new rhythm of family. At the fair, the children squealed at the ducks and competed for a teddy, which Ashby won and presented to Juniper with the solemnity of someone offering a coronet. They watched them play and felt a steady contentment that was not naive. He was aware of the precarious ledger that shaped their lives. But contentment is not the absence of fear. It is a decision, made each day, to keep building small certainties. As the sun dipped, the fair slowing like a living thing finding sleep, someone from the cafe, a passerby who had long ago filmed the clip of the robbery, approached Thea with an apologetic grin. "I owe you one," he said, meaning not the recording, but the small social debt of thanks. Thea accepted the sentiment with a nod. "You don't need any more," the man added, and the line between gratitude and obligation snapped in a way that made Thea smile. "Just keep being around." "I plan to," Thea said, and he meant it. The plan was not dramatic. It was a list of simple commitments: to turn up for school runs, to answer calls in the night when plumbing burst, to keep a spare tin of beans in the cupboard. These were the quiet oaths that, over time, became trust. Time continued to do what time does. It softened edges, made some things smaller and others more valuable. There found kindness in work, in the pauses between deliveries, and in the steady accumulation of small domestic rituals. He repaired an old chair, coaxed a stubborn radio into life for Juniper's bedtime story hour, and helped Ashby learn to ride a bike without stabilizers. There were arguments over who had left the light on, over whose turn it was to wash up. But they were the raw material of family-making rather than signs of failure. Years seemed to fold into a neat book in which the chapters were ordinary, the themes repeating with small variations. The plant on the windowsill grew taller, and the tomato plants yielded a modest harvest. Juniper learned to write in sentences that made Thea both proud and melancholy. "We are a family," read one, and Thea kept it on the fridge with a magnet where he could see it on hurried mornings. Sarin, who had once been guarded by necessity, learned to laugh without apology. She found small room for tenderness that did not feel like weakness. Ashby grew more assured at school, buoyed by the sense that he had adults who would answer when things were needed. He no longer treated every kindness as an imposter. Instead, he learned to accept it and to pass it on himself. Then, one late summer afternoon, very like the one they had first met, the small family came to sit on the bench in the park. The light was thin and the air gentle. Thea watched the children feeding bits of their paddle ice cream to one another, as if the act of sharing was a sacred ritual they'd perfected. He placed his helmet beside him on the bench and watched the city move with a patient indifference. Juniper, licking the last of her ice cream, asked the question that often returned. "Daddy, do you think being a hero could mean staying?" He thought, then let the words come without ceremony. "Yes," he said. "Stopping is one sort of courage. Staying is another." Ashby, who had matured in unshowy ways into someone who measured his words carefully, looked up. "You kept us," he said simply. The sentence had the authority of a child who had tested the weather and found it kind. Thea felt the weight of the truth in it and answered without preamble. "I kept what I could," he said. "We all do what we can." The words were small and honest, adequate to the moment. It was a modest kind of confession, and perhaps that was all that was required. He had not done anything spectacular by most measures. He had been present in small but persistent ways, had intervened when needed, and had chosen, when the ledger tightened, to trade a house for the steadiness of togetherness. That decision had cost him and also given him new kinds of richness. They stayed on the bench until the light thinned into the kind of blue that makes city edges soft. The children grew sleepy in the quiet gravity of the evening, and as they walked home, Thea noticed that his gloves were missing. Juniper insisted he wasn't allowed to be cold, and promptly took his hands, stowing them in her pockets with the little dignity of children. At home, later that night, Thea sat for a moment with the stillness he had carried around him for years and let it settle. He thought of the man who had once tried to take a bag, of the small abrasion on his palm that had been a trace of intervention, and of the long, patient work that had followed. The label "silent hero" might hang somewhere in the small public spaces of the city forever, but what mattered most to him was not the label. It was the continuation, bringing the children to school, answering a midnight cry, making space on the sofa for a friend in need. These were his medals. When he shut off the kitchen light, he heard Juniper's soft breath from upstairs, and Ashby's door thudded closed in the ordinary rhythm of the house. Sarin's radio murmured in the next room, a low, domestic accompaniment. He stood beside the window and watched the street lamps blink on. The helmet on the chair reflected a sliver of light, a small, quiet indicator of the life that moved between urgency and slow care. He understood that heroism wore many faces. Some were loud, some were private, some were short, some were long. His was one of the quieter ones, to see and to stay, to walk toward the moment that needed attention, and then to remain for the slow repairs that followed. It was a modest oath, daily renewed by the acts of washing dishes, making tea, tucking in two small people, and answering work calls at odd hours. It was, in its own way, a brave life. Outside, in the dark street, a passerby paused and looked up at the flat where a light still burned and where a small family slept. He gave the house a nod, as if blessing it for what it had become. Thea did not know the sentiment past in that gesture. He only felt the warmth of home in a way that was not grand, but was deeply enough the center of his world. They would have future days that were difficult, bills to balance, tests for the children, and perhaps, in years hence, other losses to navigate. But they would meet those days with the habit of putting one foot forward and with the established knowledge that they would not be alone in doing so. There had once thought being seen was a danger. Now he understood that being available was a responsibility and a privilege. As the city slept, he put his hand to the small abrasion on his palm and smiled to himself, a private thing that belonged to neither triumph nor vanity. He had stopped a robbery while making a delivery one ordinary afternoon, and it had become a small, public fact. Louder, quieter things followed. The selling of a house, the moving into a smaller one, the folding of towels that fit in an uneven stack, the planting of a tomato plant on a sill. All of it made an architecture that felt like a shelter for the family they had chosen to be. Juniper would grow and ask larger questions. Ashby would become steadier and think, perhaps, of his past, as the soil from which small strength sprouted. Saren would continue to hold her own, proud and competent, and Thea would continue to keep, at times silently, at times with a small private bravery. Standing at the window with the helmet waiting by the hall, Thea closed his eyes and thought of how the day that had begun with a delivery and a cone had, in its ordinary way, changed the course of more than one life. Not through spectacle, but through the steady insistence to be present. He had not sought to be a hero in the bright, applauded sense. He had simply stopped once and then, when it mattered, chosen to remain. If this story moved you, like and share it, and tell us about someone who chose to stay.